Right, so the next speaker we have today is Peter Tribble with Illumos at 6.
And you're 3 hours early.
I was thinking that.
No. This is ripped off a sort of last year's talk at FOSDEM, which was Illumos at 5, of course. So, I sort of.
Has anything changed?
I'll come to that. Yes, that's the bit of the talk I had to change, which is what have we done in the last year. So I'm going to be talking about Illumos, which is the phoenix that arose from the ashes of OpenSolaris after sort of Oracle had torched it. And Illumos comes from Solaris via OpenSolaris, and it gives you all the goodies that you got with Solaris. ZFS, which is also available in other operating systems. DTrace, which is available in some other operating systems. Zones, or containers, or sort of something that sort of Docker has popularized. FMA. This is the fault management architecture, which is basically the sort of self-healing, sort of the system will fix itself when it goes wrong, allegedly.
Not a good acronym.
SMF, the service management framework, more recently emulated by sort of systemd for those of a Linux persuasion. 5 of those were in Solaris 10. Crossbow, which is the virtualized network stack, never made it in Solaris 10, it's in Solaris 11, it's in OpenSolaris, it's in Illumos. So those are the sort of big ticket features, if you like. Now a bit of a history lesson. Going back, SunOS 4 was basically 4.3 BSD. AT&T contracted Sun to write System 5 Release 4 Unix. So SVR4 is Solaris 2.0, or Solaris 2.0 is SVR4. And it was horrible. Let's be brutally honest about this. System 5 is a terrible, terrible mistake in many areas. And of course, sort of Sun Marketing got hold of this, and they called SunOS 5.0 Solaris 2.0. And then somebody had the really bright idea that we could take SunOS 4 and rebrand it as Solaris 1, and who knows? So they why confuse? And there was things like sort of Solaris 1.1.1 U1 or something to try and match these things up. So Solaris 2.0 of itself wasn't terribly interesting. I don't think I ever ran Solaris 2.0. I ran 2.1 and everything since. So we had this mapping where SunOS, which is the which is the kernel and the core of the operating system. Solaris is the entire operating environment. It's the desktop. It's all the tools. It's everything. It varies a little depending upon the release. But at the core of Solaris 2.x is SunOS 5.x. Over this time scale, some of the earlier releases were very specifically tied to particular pieces of hardware. And in fact, that's the only reason people ever suffered early versions of Solaris, because so that was the only version of any operating system that worked on these sort of rather expensive hardware that they just bought. Solaris 2, SunOS 4 was Spark only. That's not entirely true, but Solaris 2 was x86 as well, because that's what AT&T wanted. They weren't interested in the Spark bit. There was a slight divergence because of the versions that were hardware specific, but then it was all brought back into a common code base. And there were various engineering processes that evolved in these early years. one of which is known as the quality death spiral. And the quality death spiral is basically, you're doing development, you're producing software, you're producing builds, you're producing operating system. You need people to test it, right? The problem is, if the software you're producing is rubbish, then people won't run it. If they don't run it, they won't find problems in it, they won't report problems, they don't get fixed. Bugs get worse, the thing you're doing gets worse, people are less and less likely to run it. This is a phenomenon that Sun encountered and fixed. It's a problem that SGI had and were less successful in fixing. And part of this was dog fooding. There's a machine in Sun called Jurassic, which is a machine of legend. This was the NFS file server, interactive server, and everything else in Sun's head office in Menlo Park. And the rule was, basically, every 2 weeks you built Solaris and it ran on this box. Come what may. And if you made a terrible mistake, then Scott McNeely wouldn't be able to read his email, and that would be a bit of a problem. In this time scale, there was general improvement. A lot of the really, really stupid System 5 specific junk got ripped out. To the point where you could actually run this in production without actually killing yourself. Sun Marketing came along one day and decided to change the numbering scheme. They never actually told anybody this.
I still have Solaris 7 installed media at home.
Yes, yes. That was the first evidence that this happened, because I got the install media. They changed the numbering scheme. So I phoned my friends up at Sun and said, well, you've changed the numbering scheme. Oh, no. So, yes, they didn't tell the engineers until about a month later. So they dropped the 2 point off the beginning. But still, SunOS 5.x was Solaris X. Solaris 7 was 64-bit on Spark. There was this little interregnum in Solaris 9 when somebody in management decided that they didn't need to support x86, despite having just spent $2 billion buying Cobalt, an x86 server manufacturer. Interesting logic going on there. But yeah, the engineers were running it on x86 anyway, so they just carried on regardless. It wasn't shipped, but it was built every build. And then in Solaris 10, we had 64 bits for an x86 and a lot of those other big ticket features that I talked about. And a lot of this was because, as of Solaris 2.6 or so, Solaris wasn't completely and totally broken anymore. So skilled engineers could actually go away and work on valuable, interesting stuff. At about the same time as Solaris 10 was going on, and there is actually a bit of an overlap. In 2005, which is the same year that Solaris 10 was released, most of SunOS was open sourced. Big fanfare, OpenSolaris came along. There are other parts of the code base as well. The code base, there's SunOS, there's things like the installer, there's the desktop. Well, the desktop was GNOME, so that was open source already, but there were various other bits and pieces. Sun had spent a reasonable amount of money buying the rights to the code.
In order to do this?
In order to do this. They spent 10 years doing this, yeah, I have to say, it nearly didn't happen. One or two people with rights in the code base got cold feet at the last minute and almost derailed it. Obviously, there's various bits of pieces that they couldn't actually open source because they didn't have the rights. There's some OEM pieces, there's some odd pieces of hardware that they couldn't get the rights to, but pretty much all of it. They had to write their own license. It's CDDL, it's much like the Mozilla license. It's a weak copyleft license. A snag for Illumos, of course, is that we are stuck with this license because we don't own it anymore. So the licensing, we can't do anything about. And there's the OpenSolaris missile crisis, which Sun Marketing just hadn't a clue what to do with this open source thing. You know, they didn't understand it at all. Despite every effort inside Sun, both marketing and engineering and some people in management, a pretty active community gathered around OpenSolaris. And then the big red thing happened. And we come along, basically Sun put themselves up for sale, so they were sort of shopping themselves around. There were takeover rumors. Originally there was a thought it might be IBM that took them over. It ended up being Oracle. I was elected to the OpenSolaris governing board and became its vice chairman on essentially the same day that the Oracle thing was announced. That was a good day. That was a good day. Now, I've mentioned Sun Marketing a couple of times, and yeah, sort of.
Never with the lilt in your voice on a happy step.
Yes, and we always said Sun Marketing couldn't market their way out of a paper bag. Clearly, Oracle can market their way out of a paper bag. They're very good at it. Yeah, so there was some hope that Oracle would come along, take away all the bits of Sun that were obviously bad, because it was fairly obvious to everybody what many of the problems were. Selling stuff for less than you're making it for isn't a recipe for a profitable company. That they might actually keep the good bits, and early on they said some helpful and encouraging things. Well, that didn't last. And basically what happened was nothing. Oracle have, to this day, made no official announcement as to the status of OpenSolaris.
Radio silence.
Radio silence. The source code repositories stopped updating one day, and that was it. We phoned, we tried to talk to people. I mean, obviously some of the engineers, sort of were able to fill us in, and there were informal talks going on behind the scenes, but at a formal level, nothing. But once you've created something that's open source and released it, you can't completely take it back. Now, obviously, Oracle, they're the copyright holder and the license holder of all the code. So they can do what they want with it, but they can't stop us doing what we want with the stuff that's out there, apart from changing the license.
They can do what they want with the bits of OpenZFS that they own.
That they own. And they can take our bits as well, because that's what the license says. So there were two threads to this. Now, Illumos is basically the code base for SunOS and Solaris. It had another name briefly for a few days until Garrett discovered it. That name was already taken. And OpenIndiana, which was based in London, Alistair of Evercity and co, and a whole bunch of us in the sort of London OpenSolaris user group, which survived for years afterwards, came up with OpenSolaris. And with OpenIndiana. OpenIndiana basically is OpenSolaris, the distro, built as it was, with exactly the same tooling and exactly the same philosophy. The initial hope, even then, was that sort of Oracle would play nice, because they promised that they would release the source code with every actual release that they put out. And, well, we've stopped waiting. That we might end up with this sort of Red Hat, CentOS, Fedora. There's a commercial one, and then there's a free one that you don't have to pay for. As I say, there have been no formal communications of any sort since then. So, what do we actually have in Illumos? And the first thing there is that there's a word there that we often use, which is Solarish, which is a way of talking about the Solaris and Illumos and the various derivatives, and their common capabilities and the philosophy and the way that they work. So there are all of the various versions of Illumos and Solaris share a bunch of common sort of things, and most things apply to all of those. So Solarish describes those. In terms of the code, Illumos Gate is the repo. So that's the repo now on GitHub. It contains the kernel, device drivers, libraries, well, most of the system libraries, most of the sort of user level commands that you have, man pages now. In terms of the way that it's structured, it's somewhere in between sort of the way that Linux is built and the way that FreeBSD is built. Linux is a kernel, so Linux is a kernel, and a Linux distribution is that plus a whole bunch of stuff on top. Whereas FreeBSD is essentially completely self-contained. Illumos is not self-contained. We're not a complete. We don't ship as part of Illumos everything that we need. In terms of build, we need a compiler. FreeBSD has its own compiler. We don't do that. We have a specially hacked, special version of an antiquated version of GCC. There are questions asked as to why we have to have this specifically mangled version. We're working on that. We need Java. There are bits of Java code in Illumos Gate that talk to various things. We'd much rather get rid of them. There's a bunch of Python stuff. There's a little bit of Perl stuff. There's no actual good reason for having these, but they're there. And then, of course, there are things that we need to build against. For instance, sort of all the encryption stuff, OpenSSL. A lot of facilities use XML. This is largely a function of their age. If they were written now, they'd use JSON. But we're talking about something written in the early 2000s. XML was in vogue at the time, and therefore there's lots of stuff that uses XML. So we need libxml2 to parse its configuration files. SQLite is used inside various things. SMF, the Service Management Facility, is basically a SQLite database, loaded with XML descriptions and, again, more encryption. Turns out that the last two, Apache and cups, are actually optional, but we do actually have things like our print stack needs to talk to those two. Most people just turn those off because they don't use it. But as I say, there's a whole bunch of these external dependencies that you actually need. To actually create a fully functional operating system, so you can't just take Illumos, you need a whole bunch of other stuff, including all that, but usually quite a lot more as well. Technically, it's possible to boot Illumos without any of that stuff. I'm aware of one person who's done it.
A fairly lonely boot environment, I imagine?
It's a fairly limited and restricted boot environment. But basically, you can, you lose SMF as a boot manager, but it's fairly. Yes, you can do it. In fact, I do have people who are using that sort of functionality for very specific embedded and kiosk-like environments. So, in exactly the same way that you can't just run the Linux kernel, so you actually have to have a distribution. And these vary, like everywhere else, by how they're packaged, what sort of market and use case they want, and of course by the personal preferences of the people involved. Some of us hold very strong opinions as to what operating system should look like. I'll talk about some of the distributions. OpenIndiana, this is the sort of granddaddy of them all, really. It is a linear descendant of OpenSolaris, the distribution. To the extent that, by and large, they track what Oracle are doing with Solaris. So Oracle are building Solaris 11 and maybe 12 or maybe not, out of the kernel and sort of the rest of the stuff. And then they have what they call userland, which is all of the third-party open source stuff that they add on top to build the entire thing. So that's X and GNOME and all the other open source stuff that you'd expect in a distribution these days. So OpenIndiana, by and large, follow what Oracle are doing in that respect, and we actually sort of ship patches and things backwards and forwards. There are times when they take different decisions as to the direction, but by and large, they will follow that thing. There's the current branch is sort of helpfully known as Hipster, and it's sort of a rolling release in the sense that there are actually no official releases come out. You know, it's basically something. Every so often, somebody will actually say, "All right, let's build an ISO," but it's not actually. There are no releases as such. OmniOS is actually very similar to OpenIndiana in many ways, except for the fact that it's built as a pure server, and it's fairly minimalist. It's very minimalist, in fact. Basically, any of this third-party stuff that you don't actually need in order to make the thing boot has been ripped out completely.
So the name is completely 180 degrees inappropriate.
Well, no, because it comes from OmniTI, which is the company that makes it. So they have this philosophy: keep your stuff to yourself. If you want Apache, you download and build your own Apache and you maintain it independently of the operating system. This is a very good idea, actually. It means that sort of upgrading your operating system will not screw up your application. There is no tie between the two. It's great for companies like the one I work for, where sort of we actually do want something completely minimalist and total absolute control over every single piece of software that lives on the box. It's a lot of work if you want to do anything more complicated. And they have commercial support. They didn't want to, but it turns out there are companies that will not allow you to run sort of software and operating systems on your machines unless you have a support contract. These companies exist. They came along to OmniTI and said, "We would love to run your stuff, and we love the fact that it's free, but our company is insisting that we pay you for it."
They're on
Here,
eventually
take
twisted.
our money.
Look, please take our money so that we can run your software. You know, so they caved in eventually. We don't have to, but because the company I work for think that OmniOS is a good thing, we do actually have a support contract with them, just to encourage them. And also that we can go and shout at them rather louder than sort of just as a random person on the street. And OmniOS is available on AWS. You can't go to the AWS list and sort of find it, but you go to OmniTI's website and they'll tell you what where the AMIs are. SmartOS is possibly the biggest, really, because it's run by Joyent. Joyent, now owned by Samsung, big cloud provider. They appear to have sort of backed off the SmartOS branding a little bit and used Triton as the branding. But they have really good engineers. They have a lot of really good engineers, and they are hammering this stuff hard. It's really a hypervisor. It's not necessarily the sort of thing you would want to run as a standalone system. It's really designed at cloud deployments. But because it's they're interested in virtualization, they ported KVM to Illumos. That was a fairly interesting experience by the sounds of it. They've brought back LX. Now, Solaris 10 had brand Z or brand X. One of them is, I forget which
Brand
one.
Z.
It was brand X.
Was it?
Yes. But that's a trademark of some other company that sort of popped their head up above the parapet, sort of just after the release, and they sort of went and sort of scribbled the name out and called it something else. LX zones, which basically do Linux syscall emulation. So you can actually run a Linux application on Illumos natively. The way this is done, it actually uses the zones virtualization framework. So you're actually running a virtual Linux system in a zone. That is not yet in Illumos proper. It's quite, unlike KVM, which is basically a driver, an extra driver, LX is a significantly invasive piece of work. It's in OmniOS now, or will be in the next, it's in OmniOS beta now, it will be in the next OmniOS release. But it means that you can actually sort of basically take a Docker image, export it, shove it into this, and it'll work perfectly. Those are the big three. Then there's a few smaller distributions. All of these three are actually sort of one-man operations. Igor has come up with sort of DilOS, which is quite different. For the first, it runs on Spark as well. Sort of. The one thing you'll realize is that none of the first three actually run on Spark. OmniTI and Joint have no interest in supporting Spark. They make commercial decisions on what to support. So that we are trying to get OpenIndiana back on Spark. It is a hard and complex process. But DilOS versus Spark. This is somebody who likes Debian. So basically, they have thrown away everything that you know on Solaris, and it looks like Debian. There are other distributions that actually really are Debian on top of Illumos. This is Illumos that uses Debian packaging and the Debian toolset, but isn't actually Debian.
I was going to say, could you trick the Illumos, could you modify the Illumos kernel to run the global zone in the Linux brand and then run Debian underneath it?
No.
Maybe.
None of those distros can.
Well, you do K3BSD?
No, well, see, OS Dyson, which I don't mention, is actually Debian stroke OpenSolaris. It really is the Illumos equivalent of Debian / K3BSD.
Less rebuilds.
So, yeah, sort of. But the slight snag with DilOS is actually a complete Illumos fork. It is very, very different. But that allows him to do interesting things with it, like do Zen. I mean, he can run as a Zen DOM0, which OpenSolaris did back in the day, but Oracle ripped out very quickly because Oracle had this thing called OVM that they wanted to push. So that's why they're not interested in KVM or Zen, because they have their own completely separate product. And DilOS is pure 64-bit as well. There's no 32-bit left. Oh yes, I recognise this one. And then there's this thing, which again is quite different. Unlike DilOS, this is actually the closest distro to pure Illumos Gate. Most of the other distros actually sort of have a slight, for OpenIndiana is relatively minor. That's just one or two patches. OmniOS is very different. SmartOS is massively different. DilOS is massively different. I can't be bothered to maintain a fork, so that's the way you go. There's laziness. I run Spark as well. I've got a pile of Spark boxes at home that I run occasionally. I use SVR for packaging like Solaris 10 did. It's all very retro. That's the word. Yeah, sort of. People.
CDE on it.
Yes. Yes, I backported CDE, which was horrible to do because CDE was the source code for CDE was designed to be built on Solaris 2.3 or something with the Sun commercial compiler at that time. Mostly it was take all that out and sort of instead of following the if-def sun bit, which was some crappy piece of code that didn't work, you just sort of used the other branch of the code that ran on Linux and BSD and everything. But yes, CDE now runs on Illumos and BSD and Linux. Personally, I hated it. I never liked it. Never liked it. I've got about 22 window managers or desktop environments now. There's no KDE, there's no GNOME, but yeah, sort of personally, I like XFCE. One of the things about messing with packaging is that I can actually do zones differently. I have infinite freedom to mess around with zones and virtualization. Anybody who uses IPS, which is the Solaris 11 packaging system, is locked into one and only one type of zone. They cannot go anywhere near it. Giant have their own way of doing zones, but again, that's designed for their particular use case. I can do anything I like with zones. I can run any other Illumos distro in a zone. Once LX comes back, I can run Docker. So it's great. This is sort of a hobby. There's
Is paid support available for this one?
how much money have you got? Not enough to make it worth doing. In other words, I did look at this. There are not enough potential customers currently able to commit to actually making it worth doing.
Nobody wants to hire a senior Tribblix engineer then?
Well, my company I work for does. Obviously, we don't run Tribblix for the simple reason you don't want your IT department and your OS vendor to be the one and the same person. There's a bus factor there that is unwelcome. And XStreamOS. Now, Sonical's an Italian IT services company, and they maintain their own distribution. In fact, this was always designed as part of the OpenSolaris project. The idea was always that it include the tools to build a distribution and to build a custom distribution. And so they do. They have a desktop and server variant for their services and for their customers to use. So it's very strongly focused at the services that they offer. So it's not, but it's sort of like an OpenIndiana spin that is dedicated very much to their services. But because of that, they actually do port various bits of software to it that we then get the patches for and can then feed back into the other distributions. It turns out that most Illumos in the world isn't the general purpose stuff. I don't quite know how big Giant's cloud is, but I'm willing to bet the Next Center is running on more machines than Giant.
No comment.
I have no idea. And most of this is actually ZFS. As I just mentioned, Next Center is the biggest and most well-known storage vendor that uses Illumos, and they came along very early in the day in the OpenSolaris project, which has caused them a lot of problems because they forked the code in about 2006 and have had.
Debian bits in there, I recall.
They've gone through Debian. I think they're now back to IPS to keep it clean. But yes, they went through merge hell to try and get back on track because they were years and years divergent. So they don't actually work with ZFS all that much directly, but things like NFS, CIFS, because we have that in kernel SMB, Comstar, which is the common SCSI target for fiber channel. they're a software-defined storage vendor, so most of the money that is actually assigned that is going on next sentence really actually goes to the hardware vendors that sell the stuff, and presumably they book it as well. So it's difficult to know exactly how much they've got. Delphix is a database storage appliance that uses ZFS. It's the home of OpenZFS, which is a sort of separate standalone project. And there's actually a lot of storage vendors that are using Illumos or OpenSolaris in some shape or form to provide storage appliances. And of course, there's a lot of storage vendors who are actually using ZFS on some other operating system. There's quite a few. There's a few using FreeBSD. There's an awful lot who've been using Linux and ZFS on Linux for years.
At the University of Leicester, we've got a HP and Intel are putting in a luster on top of ZFS and Fuse on Linux. Apparently, this is a supported combination from HP.
Yeah, I worry about the word support there, because the thing that comes out to support normally is contracts, which normally involves somebody getting a lot of money. Making it simple and easy to work is not in their interests.
Yeah, moving from an access to luster on ZFS.
Okay, so what's happened recently in the world of Illumos? Well, we have a new bootloader. This is we've been living with Grub, a really, 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 really old, buggy, and dysfunctional version of Grub, for many, many years. And lots of people have said, wouldn't it be nice to get rid of that and have a new bootloader? And somebody comes along and does it. Great thing is, of course, if you're going to do the work, right, you decide what happens. You decide how it's done. You decide where which path you're going to take. Everyone said, "Oh, we want Grub 2. We want Grub 2." So nobody stepped up to do the work. Somebody came along and said, "Thomas actually tried Grub 2." He said, "This is a lot easier." So basically, the bootloader in Illumos now is the FreeBSD bootloader. And that's great, because FreeBSD is very, very similar to Illumos. It's got ZFS in it. It has boot environments. Its entire boot management system mirrors ours.
Is that because the work they did to bring ZFS to FreeBSD, or was it already a good match?
It's largely the fact that it's ZFS native that makes it a really, really good match.
Because presumably the common sort of BSD heritage to Solaris is so far in the past that that's irrelevant. I mean.
Oh no, it's not irrelevant, because the easiest way to get a driver working on Illumos is to take a BSD driver and sort of just make a few modifications and you're done. And there's no licensing compatibilities or issues either. The transition between Grub and the new bootloader is interesting. Changing your bootloader is is actually a one-way process. It took Oracle, who did actually go down the Grub 2 route, over a year, I think, to actually do Grub 2, because they wanted you to be able to go back. That was a requirement, that you be able to roll back.
You're running ZFS, don't you just
no.
and do
Yes. The root file system you can roll back. The trouble is that your old root file system has got Grub on it. It doesn't have. The old file system does not know about the existence of the new loader. In fact, what Oracle did was they went back. When you go from old Grub to new Grub, they go into every single one of your old snapshots and modify it to make it Grub 2 compatible. We could do that.
So you can roll back, but you've not rolled back your bootloader.
You don't roll back the bootloader. And in fact, there's no, for instance, the old boot environments have no configuration on them the bootloader will recognize. So it doesn't know what to do with them. It works because you can actually go in manually and tell it what's supposed to happen. But yeah, let's say it's relatively straightforward to script around if you wanted to. But
I do like SmartOS's approach of read-only boot media.
yes, this is already in OpenIndiana. it's already in Tribblix. This is largely the case of when it came in and when sort of releases came out, and it's coming in the next release of OmniOS, which is delayed because it's doing things like updating the bootloader. Sorry. Okay, what else have we got? What other things have we done? We have some other old stuff. We have this. Sun use their own private fork of SSH. Why? Eventually, I mean, in fact, it was Debian's fault. Debian changed the default algorithms that they would accept to be a set that had no overlap with Sun SSH. And eventually, sort of, we caved in, and sort of somebody actually.
You have a jump host that's got intermediate set algorithms.
Yeah, it was horrible. Well, I mean, there's the standard rule. Yeah, sort of. This is how you fix your sort of Debian machines to actually allow connections from old SSH clients. With the you don't really want to do this. At this stage, most of us have sort of bitten the bullet anyway, and sort of used OpenSSH instead. Da-da-da-da. It's all right, stay. And then eventually, sort of, we just kicked Sun SSH out of the code base. Things like ASLR, exploit mitigation, position independent executables coming soon, sorts of things that people expect on other on other operating systems and we didn't have. And of course, as time goes on, we've got all these other things that we're using, and they aren't static. They're a moving target. So we've had to make everything work with newer versions of Python, with newer versions of Java, and a way to make the thing build with different versions of things, because obviously all the different distributions don't update all these tools in lockstep. USB 3 just went in last week. Contributed by Joyent. Now Joyent are a server company that do cloud services.
USB sticks, they boot their systems off perhaps?
Yeah, and there are interesting pieces of hardware that only have USB 3 on them. This was NVMe, storage, say for things like sort of finding out what disks you've got without running an interactive command like format. Okay, I've got to speed up. Using Illumos, you can download it, run it. A lot of the smaller cloud providers, if they say allow you to boot from a custom ISO and run your own operating system, they work just fine, because most of these people are KVM anyway. Building it, I'll leave these on the slides. You have to be running Illumos to build Illumos, and that actually means one of those.
You can't go and take an old Solaris 10 box and build it or something?
No, unless you're Gary, and God only knows what he's done. There was a time when you had to do that for Spark, and it's fiddly. And what it does is it generates basically a make install target that's basically the entire file system and a bunch of packages. If you want to help, use it. Report back. Tell people you're using it. We don't really have third-party developers here. That's the most important thing. They test their stuff on Illumos. If they have portability and standards issues in their code, we will find them for you. We have a very strict build environment. Contributing, yes. Oh, there's a nightmare story here, yes. OpenZFS is actually a mirror of Illumos. Their source code is our source code. There's a bidirectional sync between the two. We're both living on GitHub, yes. They used GitHub's PR mechanism. We don't. We have a massively arcane system that all boils down to the fact that Illumos is not an organization. There is a source code base and a name, and that's basically it. There is no Illumos organization, there's no foundation, there's no ownership, there's no leadership, there's a bunch of independent people and companies doing their own thing. Right.
We're out of time for questions.
Ha!
Although, we now have a 15-minute coffee break. so you can feel free to grab him out while we have coffee.
And just to say as well, sorry, that there's not a talk in here next. So you're welcome to stay here, but in 15 minutes.
It's going to start up over there.
KG Neon unboxing experience will be happening in the main lecture theatre.
Yeah. And then after that, I'm in here doing my talk on Let's Encrypt. But thank you very much.
I'm sorry for barging in, I didn't realize you were still going.
That's all right.
So what's the selling point for Illumos then? Because you can get ZFS on BSD, you can get DTrace on BSD. You can kind of get them both in Linux depending on licensing.
Well, no, depending upon sort of your vendor's attitude to religion, basically.
If you're free, if you're open to, if you've got choice, what's the selling point of Illumos over, say, running Debian?
I mean, ZFS is absolutely native to Illumos and to BSD now. Linux is still resisting going down that route as a first-class citizen. I mean, it never will be a first-class citizen because of licensing, but people are also still resisting it as a first class.
There's still a big chunk of memory management that's done in two different ways.
Well, yes, I mean,
So one view of the world, Linux has a different view of the world. They don't meet.
And yeah, so the people who did the ZFS port to Linux have been very, very careful on obeying all the licenses. What that means is that they've had to replicate various bits of kernel code that are present in Linux, but they can't use. Because if you look at the Linux kernel, there are interfaces that are GPL'd and interfaces that are open. And there's actually a list that says if you use these interfaces, you have to be GPL'd. If you want to use this set of interfaces, you can be anything you like. You can be commercial, you can be anything. We very religiously stick to that third-party stuff and then have to emulate enough of the missing bits of Illumos that in order to make it work.
Sufficiently so that the Debian people are actually happy to allow ZFS packaged into the primary archive now.
That's in the free repo, not the non-free.
I believe so. You can just do apt-get install without any faffing on a current Debian.
But what's the winning point of Illumos over FreeBSD then? Because you've got DTrace, you've got ZFS native.
So we have things like zones. Now, okay, FreeBSD has jails, but again, Illumos is a fully integrated, sort of fully architected system. It doesn't have things bolted on. This is all built into the core. Personally, much as I like bits of FreeBSD, I hate using it. It feels horrible.
It comes from a slightly different way of building systems. The some heritage is big systems divided up into small for users. And that's been going on for years before BSD ever existed. So there's lots of experience with carving systems up.
Is there any attempt to track some of what Oracle's doing with its own Solaris?
Not really, no.
Right, so it's a snapshot that you got a few years ago.
It's the very last. So we've started from the very last source drop. So in fact, we have the commit history all the way back to the beginning of OpenSolaris. We are, and they assume we have the exact same, but yeah, we have forked, and there's no going back.
So Oracle pick stuff and put it back in?
Oracle have taken some of our features and put them back. Without seeing their code, which of course we can't. They are allowed to do that. That's what CDDL says. CDDL says you can take it.
Are they theoretically required to release the source if they don't own the copyright?
Only if they change it.
Only if they change it.
So for instance, their ZFS acquired LZ4 compression sometime after ours did.
Are there any bugs in your implementation? Could you see if their implementation has the same bugs?
Because it should be. It should be bug
No, I mean, ZFS has forked to the point where, in fact, it occurred very quickly. Whereas we cannot read a current ZFS file system off of Solaris, and they can't read ours.
Sorry, I'm coming late. Does your ZFS do encryption?
Not yet.
Do you have a provider like Gully underneath it that will do the encryption?
You can. We do have encryption. Is I've seen the various there's a PR on GitHub in progress as we speak, and it's been in that state for some considerable time.
But I think you've just answered what was going to be my next question, which is if Oracle released some change that you wouldn't necessarily go out and reverse engineer it and try and replicate it into.
No.
I mean, so whatever the ZFS change they've made is, you've not bothered to try and track that.
No. There are. I mean, the ZFS encryption is probably the only interesting feature that we would look at. We wouldn't implement it the way they have, because their implementation is actually tied to their hardware. Yes. Yes, their keys are stored on their hardware. So you want to use their encryption, you really have to buy their encryption key store appliance and use that.
You did say that they were good at marketing.
And vendor blocking.
No, what they're good at is making a profit.